venture Cauldcoats Farm Limited against the decision by Midlothian Council to refuse an application to modify a planning obligation within a legal agreement associated with Plan Permission 14/00190/PPP. I'm Trudy Craggs, and I'm a reporter with the Planning and Environmental Appeals Division of the Scottish Government, and I'm appointed to consider this appeal and determine whether or not to modify the planning obligation. This is a virtual meeting and is being broadcast live, and as such will be stored as part of the DPA website archives and will be capable of repeated viewing. I have the discretion to terminate or suspend filming if, in my opinion, continuing with filming would prejudice the proceedings of the meeting. By participating in the virtual meeting, you're consenting to being filmed. You're also consenting to the use and storage of those images and sound recordings, and of any images or information pertaining to you contained in them for webcasting and training purposes, and for the purpose of keeping historical records and making those records available to the public. Further detail on the DPA privacy policy can be found on our website. First of all, thank you to my colleague Callum Henderson for arranging today's meeting. He is hiding in the background, but can hopefully step in if there are any technical issues this morning, and hopefully there won't be any. For the benefit of the live broadcast, can the lead participant of both parties introduce yourselves and those participating on your behalf today? So I'll start first with the appellant, if I may.
Good morning, ma'am. Thank you. My name is Fraser Mitchell from Shoesmiths. I appear on behalf of the appellant Paladin Ventures Cauldcoats Farm Limited. I will be giving evidence on certain matters, and Jan Kinsman from Education Facilities Management Limited will be the appellant's lead witness.
Thank you for that. And for the council?
Good morning, ma'am. My name is Matthew Atkins. I'm the lead officer planning obligations with the local planning authority, Midlothian Council. I will be speaking on some of the matters this morning. I'd like to introduce my colleague, Magnus Inglis, who represents the local education authority. And I'm also anticipating a further education colleague, Mark Bedwell, will be joining us. He does have some another appointment at the moment, but hopefully he will be joining us during the course of proceedings, if that remains acceptable to you, ma'am.
Will he be participating in giving evidence, or is he just attending and watching?
I think you're probably our lead from the education point of view, aren't you, Magnus? But it had been anticipated if it were acceptable to you, ma'am, and obviously the other parties that Mark may also speak on some education points as well, potentially, but would obviously take your guidance on that.
That's fine. The reason I was asking is whether you think I need to rejig any of the agenda so that he's here to deal with any of those matters, or can we just go through the agenda as it is and he'll join when he can?
I think we're content to go with the agenda as you set out, and it'll be a case of him joining as and when he can. And obviously we do have both Magnus and myself here, so we're content with that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. That's helpful. Okay, so for those who maybe haven't been involved in a hearing session or just watching today, format of the discussion is a structured discussion between the parties, which I chair and I guide. And the purpose of the hearing is to allow those taking part to put forward their views, and at the same time to allow me to obtain the information I need to determine the appeal. Relevant questions of the third party can be asked through me, although the discussion normally achieves a natural flow as we get through the session. The discussion should focus on the issues identified in the agenda that was circulated last week. Please all remember that I do have to take notes, so speak slowly and one at a time so I can keep track of what parties are saying. I may ask you to repeat if I've missed something, but hopefully I can keep up with my writing. I issued protocols last week setting out some of the rules for the hearing session, and that was really to ensure that it runs as smoothly and efficiently as possible, particularly when we're doing things virtually. I don't intend to go through these, but I would remind you of 2 points. Firstly, that teams must adhere to government guidance on COVID-19 when participating today, particularly when you're in the same room. I would also ask you to ensure that where you're not in the same room, and you may rely on your phone if you need to confer with members of your team, can you ensure that your phone or other devices are not audible during the session? It's fine to contact each other just as long as it's not audible. Good. We have set aside a day for this hearing session, although I think it's likely that we won't need all of that time. I know the agenda looks quite long, but I think some of the points may not require much discussion and really points of clarification. If we do need to continue this afternoon, we will break for lunch at a convenient point between about 12:30 and 1. We'll see how we get on. And we'll also have a short break at some point during the morning, just a wee comfort break, because it can be quite tiring and focusing on your screen all morning. Okay, before we move on to the substantive part of today's hearing session, do you have any that they wish to raise at this time? Mr. Mitchell?
Nothing from the appellant, ma'am.
Mr. Atkins, for the council?
Nothing from the council, thank you, ma'am.
Okay, great, we can move on then. Okay, so I indicated in the protocols that I would give advance notice of the documents that are likely, I think, to be referred to during the course of the hearing. And the ones that I thought would be useful to have to hand would be obviously the hearing statements, one for the appellant and there's two for the council, the briefing note by EFM Limited, the council's report of handling, the learning estate strategy update, 20th August 2019, the supplementary planning guidance on developer contributions of March 2012, and the appellant's comments, the council's response to the appeal. Now, I do refer to other documents in the agenda, but generally I thought they related to points of clarification, so we may not need to go to those documents themselves, but of course we can if we need to, so do feel free to go to those documents if you need to. And just because I've listed a few documents there that I thought might be more pertinent than others, that does not preclude any of you referring to any other documents in the evidence that you submitted before me. So don't stop yourself from going to another document. I'm quite happy to go to any document that is before me as part of the evidence. I've got the documents here. I just thought it was easier to kind of pull up and get to hand the ones that may be of most relevance. The documents will not be shown on the screen, so you are expected to work from your own devices or paper copies, whatever is easiest for you during the course of the hearing. Okay, so if we turn to the actual questions on the agenda, and hopefully you've got a copy of that in front of you. The parties are in agreement that the key issue in dispute is the appropriate level of secondary pupil product ratio. And that was clear from the statement of agreed matters which was submitted, which was very helpful. So thank you for pulling that together, both the council and the appellant. The appellant considers that the pupil product ratio should be 0.128, and the council considers it should be 0.242. So my questions are focusing on that, and I've taken them out from the evidence that you've already submitted in your hearing statements and pulled out the things that I felt I needed a bit more evidence on, a bit more discussion on. So that's why I haven't touched on some things and I have touched on others. But I will take account of all the evidence before me. So even if we're not discussing a point today, I will take that into account because it is before me in the written evidence. So that doesn't mean I'm giving it less weight or more weight. It's just I didn't feel it needed further discussion. So if we can start with question 1. Now, this came from the statement of agreed matters. I noted that at paragraph 5.1, it stated that if the appeal is upheld and the modification is allowed, the consequent changes to the Section 75 agreement would be acceptable. And I just really wanted to clarify and make sure that this meant that the council no longer considers that there's any uncertainty in the proposed mechanism as per your second reason for refusal in your decision notice. And Mr. Atkins, that may be for you, just to clarify that point for me.
Well, we've obviously this appeal is concerned around the secondary pupil product as you've identified, and obviously you'll be weighing up the evidence around that. We've identified the sort of key matters through the statement of agreed matters. Now, in terms of the other reason for refusal, which was around the primary the sort of mechanism, that was also an issue for the council in the sense of, from our point of view, the uncertainty of not setting out at the outset the sort of the base amount that would be provided for, and it would be the subject of a future calculation. And I suppose, in essence, as such, that concern would remain in terms of the primary, What I would say is that away from this appeal, Mr. Mitchell and I have been in discussion for some time, and in a sense we're close to agreement on a separate minute of variation relating to this site, where I would say we're in essence close to having an agreed position in relation to a varied primary schooling position, which does, subject to checking final wording on the basis of a revisions provided by Mr. Mitchell to the council yesterday, would sort of provide for what the council is looking for in terms of primary education. So that's a slightly separate point to what you're raising, because it's out with this appeal. So in terms of the appeal position, I think we still have an issue with the primary, but out with this appeal, we are close to achieving agreement.
And there's no issue with the mechanism proposed for the secondary then?
In terms of the secondary, I think in terms of the basis for calculating, i.e. if you were minded to approve the appeal in terms of a revised pupil product and etc., I think we'd be if you were of a mind to approve it, we'd be content with that.
Okay, that's really helpful. Mr. Mitchell, do you have anything you want to add to that at all?
Probably just a point of clarity, ma'am, from our side. Mr. Atkins has spoken about the primary education contribution there, which did form part of the original application. But just in terms of what's before you in this appeal, it's only the secondary component that we are looking to appeal. So I agree with what Mr. Atkins is saying, and I endorse that in terms of the position with the primary education, but that has fallen away as part of this process. And I
okay, that's really helpful.
Sorry, ma'am, I was just going to add, just if it would help, I think that's what's reflected in document PVL 13, so the revised section 75 agreement, which has got all other elements stripped away and focuses solely on the secondary contribution.
Okay, thank you. That's helpful. I think we can move on to item 2 or question 2, and this relates to the supplementary guidance on developer contributions. Now, there have been further written submissions on this between the parties, but I thought it was worth just touching on. Now we've got to this point, and there's further evidence before me. And the question is, what weight should I give to the supplementary guidance, given that it's almost 10 years old, and in particular the pupil product ratio of 0.22 used in that guidance? And the second point was in the question was, given that that guidance has been through a consultation process, it was approved by the Scottish ministers and it was adopted by the council, do I need to look behind the pupil product ratio used in that document, or can I accept that that's been tested and accept the 0.22 figure? I'll start with the council on this one for those two questions.
I think the significant weight remains with that document. As you noted, it was adopted in 2012, but it went through the formal process, consultation, adoption by the Scottish Government, and in any case, it reflected the sort of a long-established position in terms of the council's approach to pupil products in Midlothian in relation to new housing developments. And I think that supplementary guidance has been tested on previous appeals relating to planning obligations in the last 5 years, and I alluded to that in previous documents as part of this appeal, and that was acknowledged by the reporter in that particular appeal. So I think the weight of that document remains.
And the point about looking behind the 0.22 figure, which I think was a point made by the appellant, but there's no evidence to support that figure. Do you think I need to look behind that figure in the supplementary guidance?
I would respectfully suggest not, in the sense that it will have gone through a vigorous process in its preparation, and its approval was, as noted, went through consultation process and it was approved by the Scottish Government. So in a sense, any looking behind arguably should have been done at the time by the Scottish Government, if there was looking behind to be done.
Thank you for that. Mr. Mitchell, do you want to respond to that?
Yes, ma'am. A couple of comments on behalf of the appellant. I'm going to set out a few remarks just in terms of the framework for considering the SPG, and Mr. Kinsman is going to come in and address a couple of points in relation to the second question. The first thing before making my more substantive remarks was just in terms of the comment Mr. Atkins made in relation to previous appeals supporting the SPG. My understanding is that the appeal that Mr. Atkins is referring to is the Hopefield appeal, which has been submitted, or the decision for that has been submitted in evidence. I think that the comment I would make on that is I think that the reporter was asked as part of that appeal to look specifically at the Borders Rail contribution and not look at education contributions or turn our mind to whether or not they're appropriate. So I do accept the reporter made a very general remark about both the LDP policies and the SPG policies, but it was in a slightly different context. And so turning on to the SPG, ma'am, our view is that the people product figures contained in it should be approached with some caution. And we would suggest that limited weight should be attached to them. I should stress clearly that we are not disputing the policy requirement of paying a developer contribution, but as you made the point at the outset, ma'am, we're only disputing the level of that contribution and the method by which it's calculated specifically by reference to the people product ratio. So our view that caution or that the figures should be approached with caution is based on 5 considerations. If I can just take you through those. The first is the age of the SPG. The 2012 SPG is almost 10 years old. It was published for consultation in August 2011 and it was adopted in early 2012. Therefore, the process of preparing it began at least 10 years ago. It was also prepared under the previous local plan, the 2008 local plan for Midlothian, and used methodologies that were scrutinised as part of that earlier local plan process. The legislation envisages that in that time period from when the SPG was adopted, we would have been through 2 turns of the local development plan, with an opportunity at each stage to reassess the robustness and the accuracy of the conclusions and the policies in the SPG. We have in fact only been through 1 turn of the local development plan. And finally, even if its terms were considered robust in 2017 when the LDP was adopted, that plan is only a year away from being replaced. The second consideration is the updated evidence that we have produced as part of this appeal, which is contrary to the figures contained in the SPG. The data that informed the SPG, as I've stated already, would be at least 10 years old, and the policies framed as a result of that data would be looking forward to provide mitigation for developments that would occur in the future. We're now in a position where we can look back over that 10-year period and assess whether the figures contained in the SPG are in fact accurate, or from this vantage point, whether they no longer reflect the factual position. And our evidence, which is contained in the briefing note and our hearing statement in particular, indicates that the pupil product figures are no longer appropriate and therefore should be reassessed. The third consideration, the third consideration is the fact that the Council has accepted that other figures in the SPG are no longer applicable. And by this, I mean the Borders Rail contribution in particular. And by way of background, when the 2012 SPG was adopted, it contained details of the projected cost of the Borders Rail project and the contribution that would therefore be due in respect of each residential unit coming forward in Midlothian in the relevant corridor. Now, through the passage of time, the eventual costs of the project have become known, as did the numbers of residential units that would contribute to those costs. And that led the council to accepting that the per residential unit contribution for the Borders Rail project should change from that referred to in the 2012 SPG. And I would say in that context, the council did not consider itself to be beholden to the figures in the SPG, where the evidence indicated that they were no longer justified. So it's similar to this appeal, where the policy requirement under the SPG to make a contribution was justified, and we accept that in this appeal, but the detail in connection with the level of that contribution was not. The fourth consideration flows from case law, which indicates that a policy is not in and of itself justification for a planning obligation. And the LSIC case makes the point that, and I'll quote from it, the inclusion of a policy in the development plan that the planning authority will seek a planning obligation from developers would not make relevant what otherwise would be irrelevant. Now, the context of that quote differs slightly from the matters in dispute in this appeal, because we are not challenging the principle of the planning obligation, which is what happened in LSIC, but we are challenging the detail, which in this case is the level of payment derived from the pupil product ratio. So in that context, I think the court's opinion and the court's view is applicable here. And in plain terms, that means that including a contribution in policy does not alone justify that contribution. It's still possible to assess whether the contribution sought or the level of it provides the relevant mitigation to make the development acceptable in planning terms. And the fifth consideration, ma'am, flows from the terms of the Section 75 agreement itself, which under Clause 6 provides for a reassessment of the pupil product ratio to take place. And we'll come on to discuss that later, but that exists, or that rather that contains a mechanism for the pupil product ratio to be reassessed based on an up-to-date assessment of the pupil census for schools in Midlothian. And that clause is included to ensure that where the evidence indicates that the pupil product ratio should be revised, it can be done. And at the very least, our submission would be this suggests that the council is aware that the SPG figures may well be of their time and may well need to change, and that evidence which is available subsequently may indicate that a different figure should be used. Now, ma'am, that's my broad framework, if you like, and I'm going to hand over to Mr. Kinsman just to say a few words.
Thank you, ma'am. Yeah, so I particularly noted your point about looking behind the pupil ratio used in the SPG, and I noted Mr. Atkins replied to you earlier that he referred to a long-established, I think it was, position regarding pupil product, and that any looking behind perhaps should have been done by the Scottish Government when the SPG was adopted. And I'm not suggesting that due process wasn't followed when the SPG was pursued and adopted. However, as far as I can see, the background to the PPR of 0.22 in that document is unclear, and it's unclear whether the document, whether the background has ever been critically considered. I've looked back at the committee report, which Mr. Atkins kindly sent me, regarding the adoption of the SPG, to see if there was any commentary in that regarding the pupil product ratio, and there is no debate as to the pupil product ratio at that time, so I found that wasn't informative in that respect. But what I've also done is to look back at the predecessor document, which was an SPG approved in November 2001 and updated in November 2005. In that document, you find the same pupil products for primary schools for denominational and non-denominational, and the same pupil product for non-denominational secondary schools. So there is a slightly different pupil product for the denominational secondary schools, which is 0.0125. So that is a slightly different figure. I beg your pardon, ma'am, I said there was a pupil product for denominational primary schools. There wasn't one stated in that document, but it is the same for non-denominational primary schools. And they explain in the document that a ratio for denominational primary school children wasn't included because of there being considered to be adequate capacity in the denominational primary schools. So in effect, the previous SPG contained very similar figures. So it seems to me that in 2012, the document simply rolled forward with a minor adjustment, the secondary pupil product that had previously been used, and I know absolutely nothing about the process that would have been undertaken back in 2001 and 2005 when it was reviewed. But it does seem to me that it wouldn't be possible really for you to look behind the PPRs. They are, as Mr. Atkins says, long established figures, but as we've already set out, we do think they are of their time, and that time was probably 20 years ago, and the means by which they were actually calculated, we simply don't know.
Yeah, I mean, the purpose of today is, not to look behind the SPG necessarily. That's gone through a process, it's been adopted, it's been approved, and is in place. Yeah. Thinking about what you're saying about the fact this figure is slight differences between 2001 and what we've got now in 2012 supplementary guidance, we perhaps support the Council's position, aside to the fact that you feel there's no justification for that figure, that it is a long established figure. Yeah. It's been in policy and guidance for a considerable amount of time from the Council's perspective. So that would support Mr. Atkins' view that it's a long established position within the Council. And I guess your point is that the lack of clear justification or critical analysis of the figure just lends to your argument that I should give the supplementary guidance not much weight in my decision making going forward. Mr. Atkins, do you want to come back on any of those points that have been raised by the appellant?
Yeah, sure. I'll just respond to a couple of them, and I might just quickly as well bring in my colleague, Mr. Inglis, as well in a moment, if I may. So, obviously, the current supplementary guidance was adopted in 2012, as Mr. Mitchell's rightly noted. That makes it almost 10 years old. But age in itself does not necessarily diminish the weight that should be attached to it. So, for example, the Scottish Government circular on the use of planning conditions dates from 1998, but that remains in force as guidance for planning authorities in relation to conditions, and Circular 03 of 2012 only received an update at the end of last year, almost 10 years after that came into force. So age in itself does not necessarily diminish it, and without unduly focusing on what took place in relation to the preparation of the 2012 guidance, clearly it would appear from what Mr. Kinsman has just said, and it predated my time with the council, but clearly there was some degree of review of pupil products in the past if the denominational primary one changed. It wasn't clearly a case of on the face of it, across the board rolling forward, because obviously the denominational primary one was updated, so there will have been some analysis to have led to that view. And in response to Mr. Mitchell's point about the Elsa case, absolutely acknowledge the court's observations on the point he raises, but equally I would, as you might expect, reference Section 37 of the Planning Act and the requirement to have regard to the provisions of the development plan in terms of decision making, and obviously as this is adopted supplementary guidance that forms part of the development plan, and obviously I would, as you'd expect, focus on that and the weight that should be afforded to that in the decision making that we have here today. But if I could just perhaps ask Mr. Inglis just to perhaps come back and respond particularly to the points that Mr. Kinsman raised about pupil products, in particular, obviously in relation to the secondary pupil product around the 0.22, that might be helpful as well.
Okay, thank you. Yes.
Yes, come on now. Just to touch on the primary pupil products first.
You're very
Very
clear.
faint.
Faint. So you can change, put your sound up slightly.
I go through this from time to time that for some reason my microphone picks me up very quietly. People hear me if I speak like this?
Still very faint.
Yeah, sorry, the setting for the microphone is at its maximum level, so this is, other than shouting a bit louder, I can't do much. I'm hoping that everybody can hear me. For the pupil product for the primary schools, the Learning State Strategy Update report in 2019 set out that we had done analysis of recent house building programmes in the area, and we found that actually the 0.308 for primary schools was below that in certain developments. We were finding 0.38, quite a few developments, and indeed as high as 0.47.
So can I just check, when you refer to the 2019 report, was that the May Learning Estate Strategy Update?
I believe so. I'll just check the date. Yes, the May 2019.
Yeah, thank you.
In relation to the secondary pupil product, that's based on an extrapolation of the primary school product. So we examine the stay-on rates, and we have examined the rate at which children move from primary to secondary school. So I did an analysis of the last 4 years of primary 7 pupils moving into secondary 1, and to see if there was any drop-off or change in that number. And I found that actually there's a slight increase in the number of pupils in S1 compared to the numbers leaving primary 7. So the established primary pupil product is therefore feeding straight into the secondary schools. Excuse me, I'll take a passport. The calculation of the 0.22 was done on the basis of a stay-on rate that was established and prepared from analysis of the S5 and S6 rates. At that time, that was the figure that was calculated. I've done some looking at more recent analysis of the S5 and S6 stay-on rates, and that is what has produced the 0.42. So we find that, well, complicated to explain. If you assume that the number of children in a year's cohort is equivalent to 1, you then have a certain number of pupils will leave at the end of S4, and a certain number will leave at the end of S5. So rather than having a full 1 in S5 and a 1 in S6, it drops off a little bit. So the combined stay-on rate from S4 to S5 and S6 at the moment is averaging 1.41. So therefore the number of years of pupils in a secondary school is averaging out as 5.41. And if you then divide that by 6 and multiply by 7, it gives you the equivalent stay-on rate. And that is the figure that we're now finding that produces the 0.242 as the stay-on rate for secondary. So to summarise that, there have been, and we said this out in the evidence, there has been a number of initiatives since the 0.22 still or figure was originally created. So the government has pushed on. We have introduced education maintenance allowance. We've got moves for positive destinations, and these sorts of initiatives, which have increased the number of people staying on into S5 and S6. So that's why we have found that looking at the statistics of the stay on rates, that is now demonstrating a slightly higher pupil product for secondary.
Can I just ask a quick question? Why would there be more children going to S1 than leaving P7? Being really simple, you think that all those kids in S and P7 would move up to S1?
Yeah, so it may be a number of different factors from that. The majority of families who move to, or people who move into Midlothian are generally speaking starting families, but some people will move in who are just before they start secondary school. So the child is going to have a transition of school anyway. So that's one of the steps where they may choose to move it at that point.
Okay, thank you. I understood the point about that a year being one, and therefore it's less than one in S5 and S6, because there's less. Some people leave at S5 and S6. Let the appellant come back and comment. Jan might have a comment on that, and Mr. Mitchell might have a comment on that.
Ma'am, I'll hand over to Mr. Kinsman again to deal with substantive points, but if I understood that correctly, and this is more of a procedural point, but is the evidence that Mr. Ingles just spoke to, is that before the appeal? Has that been submitted prior to today?
If I can answer that, ma'am, there was in the council's case, we did set out the calculation for the 0.22 and the 0.242, just on a very simple basis.
I think the descriptive part of that calculation is in the evidence. I think it probably comes out with the hearing statement and perhaps the statement of case. I think the descriptive part is there. I don't think it was articulated in the fact that year is equal to 1 and S5 and S6 is less than 1. But I think there is something in there because it came out. I think it was the hearing statement to find that the fact that it used to be 5/7 and it's really come up to 5.5/7, and that is in the evidence, which is what that evidence really is, that you get to 5.41 years. Divided by 6 times 7, and in the evidence it was to justify the increase from 0.22 to 0.242. There was that indication that it had gone from 5/7 to 5.27, and hence the increase in the figure. So I'm satisfied it probably wasn't set out in exactly the same way, but I think the point is in the evidence before me that it's 5.57 as opposed to 5/7, which gives you the comparative ratio.
Okay,
Are you happy with that, Mr. Mitchell? Mr. Kinsman, do you want to come back?
Thank you, ma'am. Yes, I understand better now exactly what the process was. I haven't got the numbers in front of me, as it were, for the 0.242, but I don't dispute that. But the principal difference here is whether you're looking at primary children resident in a development, and I accept that council's seen some high figures, but whether that translates through to increases in demand for secondary education places. And that's the key, one of the key points, if you like, about the pupil product that's being used, is that it doesn't reflect what actually happens, because at secondary level there are wider considerations. And what's being assumed in taking the direct relationship from the primary through to the secondary is that that people are all new to start with, new and additional pupils, and that they all are all going to, in effect, stay living in the same house and thereby create that level of additional demand at secondary level. And that is plainly not the case, as we have demonstrated in relation to previous figures, to examine what's actually happened in terms of the changes in secondary demand. So I understand the calculation, not disputing the mechanics of it. I appreciate that, but it's the conclusion that therefore equates to an additional demand on secondary education places of that scale is what is misleading the council in its figures.
Okay, so it's an additional demand element from the development rather than the generic pupil product ratio for education figures. So you think it should be the additional demand from the development that you're focusing on?
What I'm saying is, at primary level, the council focuses on the population resident of primary school age, and we don't have an issue with that. We're accepting that approach. But what we're saying is that doesn't hold good for secondary, because there are wider considerations.
I think I've actually got a question on that, which we'll come on to later, about
yes.
your comment about why it's diluted.
Yes.
So I think that touched on that point that you made.
Exactly.
So I think we'll go into that more detail down, because I was just interested to understand that a bit more about this dilution effect, which is kind of what you're saying here, that you're looking at the population residents for primary, but it's not a simple rolling that forward to secondary, because there's these other factors which dilute that impact. And we'll come on to that. I think I'm understanding the first feature. I will let Mr. Inglis come back on any final comments you've got, or Mr. Atkins. I understand this party's positions on the SPG very clearly. We're not going to get agreement on that today, and that's a matter for me as a decision maker to come to some view on that. I understand where the party coming from the background to the people product ratios in the SPG, and we'll come on to those points you've made, Mr. Kinsman, later on. But I'll let the councillors have any final comments you want to make in response to any of that, and then we'll move on to the next question on the agenda.
Thank you, Ma'am. It's really just for whether Mr. Inglis had any particular points that, from an education point of view, he wished to sort of respond to from what Mr. Kinsman's just set out.
Yes, ma'am. Although it was not submitted in evidence, the analysis I have done of primary 7 to S1 stay-on rates has shown that actually there isn't a established of a drop-off in those figures. So we are finding that the number of schools in a primary school then translates into the number in the secondary school.
Okay, and yeah, I mean, there's no figures before me to substantiate that, but that's you're speaking here as the local education authority, and that's what you're seeing, that there's no drop between P7 and S1. And the appellant will have chance to comment on that later on in the agenda. Yeah,
so I looked at 4 separate years of transition, the last 4 years for which I had data available, which included up to the 2020 S1 intake.
Mr. Kinsman, yeah.
Just one point on that, and I don't know whether Mr. Inglis is able to comment further, but one possible reason for an increase between P7 and S1 maybe cross-border movement with pupils from other local authority areas coming to Midlothian for the benefit of the secondary schools, and had that detailed evidence been in place, we might have, sort of sought to look at that aspect as well. And maybe Mr. Inglis can comment on that or not. I don't know whether he's looked at the origins of the S1 pupils.
Yes, we have placing requests that come in from children from other local authority areas. These numbers are, I would need to go and have a look at the figures, but these are not particularly high numbers. We do have an arrangement with East Lothian Council for denominational secondary education at St David's High School, and we have, again, I would need to go and check the figures, but I think it's roughly 100 pupils who come from East Lothian and go to St David's High School.
I didn't quite catch the number of the figure.
It's roughly 100 pupils who come from East Lothian who go to St David's High School.
Okay, but that evidence isn't before the inquiry. You couldn't orally, but there's nothing behind that before me. Okay, let's move on to item 3, and this relates to figure 1 of the appellant's hearing statement. And it shows that since 2006, the secondary pupil numbers have remained fairly constant. And I just wondered if the council accepted that that was the case.
I would suggest my interpretation of those figures is that what we are seeing is a significant increase since 2018. The 2020 census figure, which has been published by the Scottish Government, but I think the evidence from the appellant included up to 2019. The 2020 census figure was 5,429 secondary pupils, which therefore shows an 8.7% increase across 3 years.
But if you're between 2006 and 2018, it was fairly constant.
It was fairly constant. From 2018 to 2017, the roll averaged about 5,067. And we have now, since that time, we've increased to 5,429. So that's quite a big step.
So was your first figure 5,057? Is that what you said?
5,067 was the average for the 10 years prior to the increase coming into effect.
Now it's 5,429 in 2020. And I think we can see from figure 1 that it is going up 2018, 2019. Obviously 2020 isn't shown on that. But you're saying rather than looking like a gentle increase, it's more significant than what's shown in figure 1.
Yes, the pupils start secondary school around about age 12. So as the house building took place around about 2007, 2008 is now starting to come through. We are able to track those numbers by looking at the year of age of each child within primary and secondary school. We can see that there's quite a big step in the increase in the number of pupils, and that has now started to arrive in secondary school. So that dates back to the houses that were built around about 2007, 2008, and the ongoing house building since then.
Thank you. Mr. Kinsman, do you want to comment on that?
I think your question, Mum, was about what had actually happened, and I think the council's accepting figures as I expected they would do. Obviously, there is an uptick in the figures, which we can certainly see, and that's why I produced figure 3 that we'll come on to no doubt later on, because we're not disputing an uptick. It's all about the scale of it and whether or not the pupil product that's being assumed is likely to be correct or not. We don't have any detailed evidence from the council on these points, which does make it a little bit tricky trying to associate the impact of housing from 2007-8 onwards. Is quite difficult. We've not been able to examine that in any detail to understand whether or not that would be correct. But I don't dispute the figure that I actually had a figure from somewhere of 5,427 as the 2020 figure, but whether it's 5,429 or 427 really doesn't matter, so there's no dispute about the figures.
So I think on that basis we'll move on to question 4, and this kind of just follows on from that, and maybe there's not a huge amount to say at this point. Because I got to the point where I thought it does look like there's an increase since 2018. I think you've probably answered this to a certain extent, Singles, that I wondered if this trend was likely to continue, particularly given the number of type of units that have planning permission. And I'm assuming, based on what you're saying, how you're tracking through the pupils dating back to houses that were built in 2007 and 8, that if those houses continue on stream as per the planning permissions, in your view, there'd be a corresponding increase in pupils coming through the system. That's fair?
Yeah. Yes, ma'am. We can see each year group of age is continuing to increase. So we're now sitting at the figures like 2008, 2009, region of sort of 800 children per year of age, 800 to 900. What we're now seeing in the beginning of the secondaries is that we've gone over 1,000 pupils per year of age, and in primary we're getting towards 1,200 pupils per year of age. By they start school at age 5, so we have another 2 years of growth. So if we were to stop building houses now, until we got planning permission, we would continue to see growth coming through right from the numbers we are currently age 1 and so on. With 12 years time they would arrive in secondary school. So we have for 12 years of growth to come if we stop building any additional houses now.
You're very faint again. Maybe if others can put their mics on mute when you're speaking, that might just help stop any background noise. But I did get what you're saying. Did everyone else hear that? Okay. Just a point that I pulled out, and I think you said that in 2020 the figure is 5,429, and I took a figure here from Mr. Kin's briefing note of 5,542. Mr. Kin's, what did you base that figure on? And should I kind of think about the 5,429 figure rather than this 5,542? It was in paragraph 3.5 of your briefing note. I think that was projected.
Yeah, yes.
The current number is the real, the actual number.
Yes, that's absolutely right. The figure in the briefing note was a projected figure, so the council did overshoot on their projection compared with what actually came to pass.
I think, Mr. Ingalls, you've kind of answered all the points in question 4. Mr. Kinsman, do you have anything you want to comment on about this relationship between and the lag between house building and pupils kind of turning up at school in secondary school?
Yes, thank you, Mel. It clearly is very difficult to associate the two things. There's clearly a relationship, but understanding how that manifests itself is very tricky. One of the things that I've done, and this is prompted actually by your question 4, was to look at the expected increases in children within the authority area of secondary school age, and I wanted to understand what the Scottish Government's forecasts were for that, and that does show continued increase over the next few years, and I don't think that's significantly different to what we're expecting. And that's with the pupil product we are using, so it's back to that figure 3. We are expecting to see continued growth. To be perfectly straight with you about it, this wasn't information I'd looked at the time we prepared our hearing statement. It was inspired, if you like, by your question, and it does more or less confirm, it does indicate there would be a slight increase in the PPR, and I can give you some more figures for that if it matters, but I think our position is that it doesn't matter very much, because as we'll come on to, there's an opportunity for the council to revisit the figure that's been used in our section 75.
And obviously I don't have that evidence because it's not before me, but I think you would still say there that your PPR, the 0.128, you'd still probably take the view that it's the most realistic and reasonable figure. And that even if it was slightly more, the accounts are protected because of the clawback provision in the section 75. Okay.
Absolutely. I mean, just to give it orally, and I appreciate you've got nothing in writing, and that I don't want to overcomplicate things, but the figure I'd come out with on the basis of the population projections going forward would be 0.14. But it's difficult to follow these calculations in an oral hearing, obviously, and I don't. But the point is, it's a bit higher than our 0.128, but not by very much. It's a marginal difference, and it would make a marginal difference to the green line that you see on figure 3.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Ingalls, do you want to come back in?
Thank you, ma'am. I think you have a question later on regarding figures 3. I don't know if you want me to cover that just now, or if you want to wait until that point.
If you wait till that point, it was just, if you've got anything more to say in relation to question 4, and you can pick it up later on in relation to figure 3, because it's maybe more pertinent to figure 3, looking at the different increases at that point. I don't mind either way.
And so the figure 3 is based on the figures which are in the Midlothian Local Development Plan, and the reference is made to table 2.3 in the Midlothian Local Development Plan. That table actually sets out the housing supply, that's the housing land supply, rather than the housing supply target. So that is so the housing land supply is the number of potential house building plots which are available. The housing land audit sets out the number of houses which are expected to be built. So table 2.2 within the Midlothian Local Development Plan has the housing supply target, which is 4,410 houses across the 2019 to 2024 period, which is quite a bit less than the figure the of my head, I think was it 6,300?
306. Yeah. What was that? So what was that figure again between 2019 to 2024?
4,410 houses.
Okay, thank you.
And the housing land audit, which is another published document on the council's website, sets out the progress towards actually building those houses by house builders, and the agreed build out rates for the next 5 years. And looking at that just now, over the next 5 years, the expected number of houses delivered in each year does not exceed 1,000 on any one of those years. So in fact, our projections for the capacities required for schools are based on that housing land audit, roughly 1,000 houses per year. So we are anticipating a significant increase in the number of pupils, but not quite at the figures set out in evidence. And in response to the house building in Midlothian, that's why the council developed the learning estate strategy, 2017 to 2047, which we included in evidence. And the anticipated total cost of that in order to meet our statutory obligation to deliver education is £343 million. So it's a significant document.
Okay, well, we'll come on to figure 3. Is there anything else anyone wants to add at this point in time in relation to question 4? Or can we move on to question 5? And question 5 is about the dilution of the effects of the secondary school. Is everyone happy to move on to question 5? Yeah. Okay, so this was kind of touching on the point that we've just covered in slightly, and it was your comment in paragraph 5.6 in the comments to the council's response to the appeal. I just wanted to go into, as I said before, to explain how the local effects of individual developments are diluted when considering secondary schools. And you've touched on that, but it'd be good just to go into that in a little bit more detail to understand that a bit better.
So yes, indeed, Mum, we've touched on that, and it's an important aspect to understand. So what we're saying is, first of all, we're not disputing the experience of relatively high numbers of primary aged children resident in areas of new housing, and we also note that it's a reasonable expectation that primary school capacity is made available locally to meet the needs of those children. And we also anticipate demand from primary education to be evident from a fairly early stage of development build. So we, if you like, we characterise the primary education issue in those terms, and which is why we're accepting the starting point, which is in the section 75 of point 308, and it's quite easy to understand. I think if you've got development of 350 dwellings with perhaps just over 100 primary aged children, then that's going to have quite an important local impact. That represents about half of a one-stream entry school, so it's quite a big effect, especially if schools locally are full. The key point for secondary is that the catchment areas are much larger, and we expect pupils to travel independently to school, and that's what I'm meaning by using the word diluted, that the implications need to be considered over a much wider area, and other factors are coming into play, like where people have moved from, whether they are entirely new to the area, factors like that. And just to give a bit of scale to that, there are 6 secondary schools in Midlothian and 32 primary schools. As things stand at the moment, I think that's right.
Thank you, Mr. Engels. Do you want to, or are you finished with the Kinsman, or do you want to add anything more?
No, that's fine, thank you.
Yes, thank you, ma'am. There's a few different concepts, I think, set out in that paragraph and in that. One of them is that the impact of a development on a catchment area, and what I would have to say about that is that a large development in a small catchment will clearly have quite a big impact on the number of pupils coming forward from that. However, the larger catchment areas of a secondary school can contain a significant number of different developments. Therefore, it still has the significant impact. And also, what we have the catchment area for the Shawfair development is Dalkeith High School, which is based in Dalkeith. So this is slightly more than 4 miles away from the Dandle Hall Primary School, which is in the Shawfair area. That's quite a relatively small pre-existing population. It produces roughly 40 children of each year group of age, and they are transported up they get transported by school transport across to Dalkeith High School. The Shawfair development as a whole is going to be in the region of 4,500 to 5,000 houses. It will produce over 1,000 pupils is our expectation, and transporting 1,000 pupils across the bypass to Dalkeith is we are at a point there where we could be building a very sustainable high school. The capacity of Dalkeith High School is 1,050 pupils. So the pupils arising from Shawfair on its own would exceed the capacity of Dalkeith High School without taking into account any of the other existing housing and planned developments in the area.
So I would like to think that you don't accept that the effect of individual developments is diluted in connection with secondary schools, because there's larger catchments with more developments in the catchments, therefore there's still an impact. I'd
say there's two elements that yes, there's a larger catchment area, therefore it need to be considered on the basis of all of the developments in the catchment area that we were considering. And in the specifics of Shawfair, the Shawfair development is as I say, is 4,500 to 5,000 houses. That's a very significant development. Which is all feeding into one catchment area, which is into the Dalkeith High School catchment area. And there are other developments taking place in the rest of the Dalkeith catchment area as well.
Mr. Kinsman, do you want to comment?
Thank you, Ma'am. Of course, we accept that there are wider issues at play. We understand what the council's proposing, and indeed we're making a contribution to a new secondary school. The question is the scale of that school and how it's going to relate to the overall provision within the area, because I'm sure the council will not want to be providing spaces at a new secondary school at Shawfair that's then going to take pupils away from other schools and leave them struggling financially, which is what happens if schools are undersubscribed. So it's, you know, they need to be looking at the whole scale of things. This is the point, with there only being a limited number of secondary schools. The impact of a new school's got to be considered and thought about in terms of what the appropriate capacity is at what stage. I haven't seen all the details of that. I know what the eventual proposal is, and I think it's overstated for all the reasons we're talking about in terms of the PPR, but I don't dispute the benefits indeed of having a new secondary school at Shawfair, given the travel distance to Dalkeith and the creation of a new community. None of that's in dispute. It's all about scale.
Okay, I can understand the two perspectives on that, and the different views about impact and scale. So I think I'm happy that we move on to question 6. And it may have been answered to a certain extent. It was about the fact that you accepted the primary pupil product ratio of 0.308 I just wondered if it was reasonable to reduce the secondary pupil product ratio to 0.128, given the relationship between the two. Now, you may feel you've answered that already because you have given some evidence of that as to why it would be less and how it's diluted. But maybe both parties, I'll start with the appellant on this one to give you a chance to comment on this, and I'll go to the council.
Thank you, Ma'am. I think we have, certainly ventured into the territory of this question, and it is about the, the scale and overall implications within the authority of new housing, and understanding what is new housing, and whether or not the high numbers that we're looking at in primary are all indeed new and additional children, and not reflecting the overall demographic changes that are taking place, because this housing is being built obviously to meet needs of just pause a minute if that.
Hi, can everyone hear everyone now? Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
I'm not sure what quite happened there. It's a general connection issue. Settling in the system.
Yeah. So
Right. Do you want to just recap on your answer to that question 6?
yes, so I hadn't finished the answer. I was about halfway through, so I just sort of reiterated our acceptance of the need to look locally for primary, and the acceptance of the relatively high pupil product ratio at primary level. And for secondary, the approach needs to be different and not on a much broader basis. So we haven't seen detailed evidence from the council, and a fully detailed assessment could include looking at the overall demographic changes, including such things as the decreasing household size, the ageing population, the migration patterns, which will reduce demand for secondary schools from the existing population, from the existing housing. But the approach we've taken here is to try and simplify that by looking at the overall position within the authority area and coming up with our PPR figure of 0.128, which assumes that the recent PPR would remain steady and the pupil numbers will grow in line with new housing. I've already referred to doing a bit of further research prompted by your earlier question, which gives a slightly different figure of 0.140.
Okay, so you're satisfied that because of the different approaches to primary and secondary, it is reasonable for the secondary pupil product ratio to reduce to 0.128 because of the different ways you assess the impact. Okay, Mr. Ingles, do you want to respond to that, comment on that at all?
Yes, I mean, I think that although as I said, it's not produced in evidence, but we have the figures to show that the pupils from primary then proceed into secondary school. Also, in relation to the reference to an ageing population, the National Records for Scotland produces data sheets for each local authority area and thus population projections of their own. They are seeing that the growth in Midlothian is generally speaking of a younger age group, a family age group, people moving into Midlothian who are then starting families rather than it being existing ageing population which is driving any demographic changes.
Okay, so from your point of view, it would be unreasonable then to reduce the secondary figure to such an extent. Do you think that doesn't reflect the reality?
Yes.
Okay, I'm going to move on to question 7. I'm happy for those questions. And again, it may be an answer, but I checked this out from the report handling. And it was the last paragraph before the conclusion. And it may be that we've actually covered this in the earlier questions, but just make sure we have, in case there's anything else you want to add. And it was just that comment. Where can I take it? So it's just a big paragraph before the conclusion of the report of handling, and it's where you've commented on the fact that the application proposes to modify the agreement to change the people product ratio for the secondary schools. And you're saying the result would be this development paying a lower amount than the approved guidance, which is the supplementary guidance. Furthermore, a lower amount in a location where there's a reasonable expectation that there will be a higher than usual people product occurring. And I just wondered why you made that comment. Why is there a reasonable expectation in relation to this development?
Thank you, Ma'am. I made that observation, and it was in the report of handling, based on the experience that we'd had, and we kind of go on to this in further questions, so I don't want to sort of answer too much too soon, as it were. But
well, to be fair, you could answer 7, 8, and 9 if you're going to go into Hopefield or Newcastle. You could combine those 3 questions.
Sure. Okay. Thank you, Ma'am. We'd had the experience at Hopefield, which we've alluded to in evidence, and that was a development of ultimately now some 1,300 houses, predominantly family houses of 3 bedrooms and above, where we have experienced a higher primary pupil product than we would normally expect of, and Mr. Inglis will be able to, I think, give further detail on this, of potentially up to 4.7. Now, that's not necessarily translated through into secondary pupils yet because of the lag effect, but certainly around about 2016 we were seeing that at Hopefield, and I've also referenced in evidence the Newcastle Great Park, which is a similar scale of development to the Shorefest strategic development area on the edge of Newcastle upon Tyne, and I also provided evidence their updated supplementary guidance from 2016, where based on their detailed experiences of large-scale new build family housing, a higher primary pupil product appeared to be occurring in relation to 4-bedroom houses. So, given the Shorefest strategic development area with the various allocated sites, including this one, is likely to give rise to, a present estimation, some 5,000 houses, and the vast majority of those will be 3, 4, 5-bedroom houses. It's reasonable to extrapolate that there is a very reasonable expectation, I would suggest, that we might not just see the, if you like, the standard people product, but actually potentially higher than that, because there is no really, apart from a small population at Danderhall, there is no latent historic population in Shorefest. So actually, it's different to the other populations in Midlothian. You're talking about putting 5,000 houses in where there's almost nothing there to start with. So it's different even to, say, Pennycook or Dalkeith, for example.
Just to combine these questions then, for looking at Hopefield and Newcastle, how relevant are they to me in the context of this appeal, and what should I take from them in the context of this appeal?
You'll need to make a judgment of how much what weight you give to those. I've introduced them because firstly, Hopefield is a Midlothian example of large-scale housing. It's not just your average 200-house development. It's the largest after the Shawfair area, and it's already happened. So it's something we can draw on. Newcastle, the example there, Newcastle actually has many similarities to Edinburgh in the sense of a large population that's in flatted developments, and that was providing family housing for those who want to have basically a garden and a garage, and that's already happened since 2002. So from two similar type developments, we've got evidence that this is what happens. These very large developments, not 150 houses, 200, so it's reasonable to extrapolate that something very similar could happen here.
Okay. Mr. Kinsman, are you responding to this? And again, if you want to take those two questions, 7, 8, and 9 together, that might be helpful.
Yes, okay, thank you very much, Mum. Well, we haven't seen any actual evidence regarding Newcastle or Hopefield in terms of the secondary impact, and perhaps it is early days, but I think you can attribute limited weight to what's happened elsewhere, bearing in mind that circumstances may be very different. And even between Hopefield and Shawfair, it seems to me that those two areas are sort of quite different in their relationship to Edinburgh City, for example. And we don't know for sure what's going to be built on our site. And it seems to me that the close relationship with the city, perhaps at Shawfair, would favour young professionals who are working rather than having families, for example, whereas Hopefield, being a bit further out, might be more appealing to families. Having said that, I don't know Hopefield as an area. It's not somewhere I visited. But I think you should be careful inferring too much from these other examples, basically. And I don't think we've got any, sort of hard evidence about what's happened at Newcastle that we can really rely on. As I say, we haven't actually got secondary numbers in relation to Hopefield. The reference is about the experience of high primary numbers is not something that we're disputing.
And just going back to the first point, question 7, do you think there's a reasonable expectation that there'll be a higher than usual pupil product occurring from this development? Is there any reason in your mind why there would be?
No, not specifically. A lot will depend on housing mix. I recognise the possibility of there being, well, it depends what you mean by usual. But if we're saying usual is the 0.308, I think it's perhaps less likely in this situation than it would be at Hopefield, for example. But I wouldn't.
Think about the 0.22 figure. Is it reasonable that you'd have a higher number of pupils going to secondary from this development than anywhere else, for example?
I don't think so, and I don't think the 0.22 is. It's not a figure we've seen supported in evidence. The 0.22. It's just the historic figure that has been used for many years.
Okay, I'm happy to move on from these 3 questions. I was going to do one last question 10 and then a wee break after that, because at that point we get into more detail about the actual figures we've used. So if we can move on to question, you've got a final comment, that's fine.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt.
No,
I just wanted to
fine.
refer back to one other thing in response to question 6, I think it was. Mr. Inglis referred to the Scottish Government population projections. which are the 2018 based figures I think he's referring to, which were produced in 2020, and those figures are the figures that I've referred to in coming to an alternative PPR figure of 0.140. So just to clarify, he's referring to the same information I think that I was referring to earlier.
Are you happy with that, Mr. Inglis? That's correct.
Just to clarify there, ma'am, the National Records for Scotland projections and the mid-year population estimates that are produced by the Scottish Government, my reference to them was in relation to the age profile of those who would be moving into the area. The figures that we use for our population projections for school are based on the current current population, the school roll of the plus the house building that we have seen and the pupil product that comes from there. I have done analysis of the mid-year population estimates as well in relation to how they take account or how they don't take account of different factors within the local authority areas, but it's not been submitted in evidence. That was for a different matter with the Scottish Government and funding.
We all work off the same kind of base. Okay. Okay, we'll just move on to question 10. And it's really a question for the council. I understand that the appellant is not disputing the need to make a contribution. I think it was touched on in the briefing paper that should there be a discount looking at other capacity. But obviously, I've got to satisfy myself that in terms of the circular that the contribution or the modification meets all the tests. So I did just wonder, and for the council, what consideration you had to surplus capacity in other secondary schools in the catchment area, and whether the full education contribution is justified or whether it should be discounted. I don't know if that's one for you, Mr. Atkins, or either of you. I think you're on mute, Mr. Atkins.
Sorry, my apologies.
All right.
I think we've already touched on this when Mr. Inglis was referring to Dalkeith High School just now, to the extent that given the scale of planned housing growth in the Shawfair strategic development area, which will give rise to over 1,000 secondary pupils, and having regard to the capacity of Dalkeith High School, and there is also planned housing in Dalkeith itself, which that is a catchment school, that the development in the Shawfair strategic development area itself justifies and gives rise to a new high school. And as we've noted, there's a very, very small only latent population in the Dander Hall part of Shawfair. So the council's position would be that a new high school is justified and a full education contribution, because that scale of growth is necessary also, and that in our view meets the circular tests.
Does the appellant have anything you want to add?
Well,
I know you're not disputing making a contribution, but you might have something you want to add.
yes, it was just a question that we raised, now several years ago with the council and never received an answer to. And I still think you haven't actually got an answer to your question, because what we don't understand is there is spare capacity at Dalkeith at the moment, and St David's, which sits on in the same area, and we don't know how that capacity has been accounted for. I mean, it must be being assumed, I would hope, that somebody is using for it, and perhaps some developers have got what we might term a free ride on the basis of that spare capacity, but we simply don't understand. So you're correct, we're not disputing it, we're not seeking to claim any of that spare capacity for our purposes, but it does seem to us as a sort of unanswered question about that.
Maybe Mr. Atkins can just follow up on that then.
Sure. I mean, thank you, ma'am. Maybe Mr. Inglis is better able to respond on the point about the that particular capacity issue?
Yes, thank you. As we've discussed previously, we have the lag effect on the number of pupils coming forward into secondaries. So the house building which has already taken place in the Dalkeith High School catchment area will take it up to above the capacity. Therefore, the way that we consider the available capacity in schools when a housing development applies for planning permission is we will look at what as I said, the current figures plus the already established and granted planning permission and the pupils we project that will come forward from that. And at that point, we then consider the impact of any subsequent planning applications that have been made. So in this instance, the housing and the planning approvals which have been given are going to exceed the capacity of Dalkeith High School. So there is a requirement to provide additional
I think it's worth noting on the back of that much of the, not exclusively, but a lot of the house building that has taken place in Dalkeith itself has been in the post 2008 period. Therefore, as Mr. Inglis was suggesting, with the lag effect, the effects of that in terms of actual pupils actually in schools has yet to come through.
But your position would be that even though it may look today as those schools have capacity, that capacity is already taken up by pupils who will come through the system in houses already built.
Yeah.
So therefore, there is no actual capacity going forward.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll ask Mr. Kinsman if he's got any final comments to make on that. So.
Well, I can understand that, although we've obviously never seen the calculations that support that position. And my only other question then on that is that I understood that the developments that have got existing consents have also got Section 75 agreements attached to them, which include contributions for the new secondary school. So I'm still in some doubt as to exactly how it all fits together.
I mean, clearly the Section 75 agreements were a matter for those developers and the council at that time. I don't know what discussions were had at that time, and it's not for me to kind of go look at them all. But I think I understand the position in relation to capacity in the context of what we're discussing today. And I accept that there are no calculations for me other than what we've seen about capacity and pupil roles and things from the evidence we've got from learning states strategy updates. We've got those. But I accept the point. There's nothing definitive to show there's no capacity. But do you accept it? I know you're not disputing paying the contribution, but do you accept it? It's reasonable to assume that if you factor in all the pupils and houses that have already been built, there is likely to be no capacity in those schools for developers coming in.
Yes, I accept that, but my query is whether or not those same developments have also or are in the process of funding additional places as well.
And that's not a matter. That's not a matter for me.
No, we can't.
I hear your point, but it's not a matter for me. I'm not sure the council wants to comment on that at all. It's not relevant to this appeal, so I'm happy if you don't comment.
All I would say is that, without getting into the detail of individual cases, that developments in Dalkeith, for which Dalkeith High School is the catchment school, enter into Section 75, well, into planning obligations to provide contributions towards primary and secondary capacity.
Okay, I'm happy to leave that point there. I suggest we have a break until 10 to 12. And we'll start at that point with question 11, which is when we're going to look at the figures in the appellate hearing statement. Figures 1, 2, and 3, probably focus on figure 3. So if we come back at 10 to 12, and we'll pick up there. Thank you. Oh, I was going to say, sorry, don't disconnect. Just put your microphones on mute and stop your videos rather than coming out of the meeting altogether because that'll cause chaos. Okay, thank you. think we're almost ready to start again. I'll just wait for Mr. Mitchell and Mr. Kingsman to come in. Hope Mr. Mitchell is there and can hear me. I will move on to question 10, which is just the next question, so we've stopped. No, sorry, after question 11. And this was focusing on the figures in the appellant's hearing statement, figure 1, 2, and 3, round about paragraph 7.4 onwards of the hearing statement. I just was wanting to give the council opportunity to comment on those figures, anything you want to draw my attention or comment on, whether you're in agreement with what they show, whether you disagree with what they show. And then in relation to figure 3, your comments on the 3 scenarios shown there, based on the various PPRs put forward, which one was most realistic, which one was most reasonable. So I'm not sure if that's you, Mr. Ingalls, or Mr. Atkins to comment on this, but really just general comments, figures 1, 2, and 3, and then picking up those points in relation to figure 3.
I think that's one for Mr. Inglis to pick up for the council.
Thank you, ma'am. Yes, the figure 1, that to me that highlights the impact that we're now starting to see of the lag and the pupil product now starting to, or the number of secondary pupils starting to increase as a result of the house building around about the 2007, 2008 and onwards. The figure 3, as we have already discussed, the Midlothian Local Development Plan has 2 sets of figures. One is the housing land supply, which is the figure of 6,300, which is quoted, and it also has the housing supply targets, which is the number of houses expected to be built, and that's around about 4,400 figure, and the housing land audit, which is the figure of house building, which is the developers have pulled together and agreed. Actually shows a house build rate below 1,000 per year for the next 5 years. So we are forecasting a significant increase in pupils. However, it's not at the it's 25% to 20% lower than the figure set out in that graph, and also the lag effect will mean that is delayed. And in addition to that, as the pupil numbers start to come through, secondary school is 6 years of pupils. So when you have an increase in 1 year of pupils, or you have an increase in houses, that then takes 6 years to feed through that school to its full extent. As mentioned, we have the learning estate strategy has been delivered in order to anticipate the house building and the demand on the learning estate. Sets out the school building that is required in order to meet the statutory obligation on the council to deliver education.
Thank you. In relation to figure 3, looking at the 3 PPRs used on there, if we think we're starting, I think at 2020, I think we said 2020 was 5,429 pupils at 2020. Is it reasonable, looking at the PPR of 0.242 in the line of that graph, that in the next 4 years, effectively, using the 2020 as the starting point, you get to a point where you're almost adding 1,000 more, well, more than 1,000 pupils on?
I think that Mr. Kinsman would need to clarify on that, but I understand that table has been produced based on 1,261 houses being built per annum, and that those pupils would immediately arrive in secondary school at that time. Whereas in fact the housing land audit, the housing delivery rate is actually going to be closer to 1,000, and there will then be that lag period before they arrive into secondary school, and it was also then be graduated as it moves through S1, S2, S3, S4, and onto S6.
Okay, so what would that mean for a graph going forward? That it would be a more gradual increase over the period?
Yeah, so the number of houses built in each year is going to be 20% lower than that graph is based on. So the line is immediately going to be 20% lower. But also there is then that what the best way to describe it is the way that will not all arrive throughout all 6 years of secondary on the same point in time. So it will not only will it be in 12 years' time, but it will also be more graduated over this course of 6 years of those houses come through.
So what I'm taking from that is there's an impact which is less than shown, but for a longer period of time as the kids transition through a school and come out the system at the other end.
Yes, so we will still have the peak number will arrive at that figure, but it would happen in year one. It'll happen by the 6th year, but we'll see a sixth of the impact in the first year, a sixth or 2/6 of the impact in the second year, so on as we go through the impact.
So are you able to give a view as to which of those lines in the graph you think is most reasonable?
I'm sorry, ma'am, but I think the graph would need to be redrawn in order to show this lower building rate. So the council's contention is that the pupil product of 0.242 is reasonable to apply it to this housing development. However, the house build rate is going to be below that, which is this graph is based upon. Or that's my understanding. Maybe got that wrong.
Okay, I'll ask Mr. Kinsman to come in and you might comment on some of those points.
Thank you, Mel. I think I understand the point that Mr. Inglis is making, and I think my understanding is that he's saying his graph would look a little different to this because of the factors that he's mentioned. I mean, my comment on that really is that the council has had the opportunity to redraw that graph and to present you with something different. It's not been raised with us informally, or I could have redrawn the graph myself on a different basis and to try and understand what the council's figures would mean. But I can't get away from the figure of 0.242, whether that comes in straight away or whether it's phased over some years, as Mr. Inglis seems to be suggesting. I think you'll have to draw your own conclusion as to which line looks most realistic, but if you look at the green line, that is the figure for 2020 is very close to what the actual figure the actual figures prove to be, you know, even in the light of that recent housing that Mr. Inglis has referred to. So I think I'm very clear that the realistic line looks like the green one or something very close to it. And we don't have anything else from the council we can compare it with, or any alternative figures to interrogate to understand whether they might have merit or not.
Based on evidence, I think that was earlier, it was said that, I think it was Mr. English, you indicated that between, I think it was 2016-17 to 2020, there'd be an increase from 5,067 pupils to 5,429 pupils. So we're looking at, say, 400 pupils in that period of time, which was the impact of the lag coming through. So you're now seeing the secondary schools coming through from the houses that were developed 2006, 7, 8 onwards, coming through the system. So that's about 400 over that period of time. And then if we look at a similar period of time from 2020 to 24, if you take the PPR 0.242, you are looking at going from that figure, probably about 5,400, 450, something like that, probably up to about 6,800 in that period of time. And it's whether that, in reality, not thinking about PPRs at this point in time, but in reality, is that realistic to think to be that big an increase in pupils coming through secondary school in that 4-year period? Albeit I appreciate it's not based on the right number of houses, but as a principle, it seems a significant increase, bearing in mind the scale of the increase between 2016-17 and 2020.
Just to go back up to check some forms. So what we've experienced for the last 3 years has been an 8.7% increase in the secondary population. And that's, give or take, is roughly about 160, 170 pupils per year. If that was to continue, I mean, this is based on house building that took place quite some time ago. But if that was to continue, then over the course of 5 years, that would add around about 800, 850 pupils to the roll. Looking at this calculation, if we're sitting at about 5,200, we would be up over 6,000 at that point. As I said, the graph is based on 20% more houses being built each year. But in fact, that, as we have said, the effect of the lag will be the increase in pupils from the houses which are being built in the years which are covered in that graph will not actually take place for another decade or so.
And just thinking about the lag, and you can see quickly how that's factoring and coming through now. Is it the case that there'll be a lag from all development that comes through?
Yes, the lag is based on the demographic of the people who move into the houses. So depending on the house type which is built, that will then have an impact on number of pupils and the time that comes through at. So if you're building family homes, it's a reasonable expectation that people will move in and have families, and therefore you're expecting to see that those children, when they turn 12, will start to come to a secondary school. So if we were building lots of one-bedroom flats, then it would be reasonable to expect it to be fewer children coming forward from those. But in this case, it's a majority of larger houses for families which are being built. Which in fact, I think.
In case you expect them to come in, have their children, and there'd be a lag as to when the impact's felt in secondary. Okay, Mr. Kinsman, do you want to respond?
Thank you, Ma'am. Yeah, it's very difficult to grapple with this without, figures in front of us. Had I understood what the council was going to be saying, I would have endeavoured to go back on the table 1 that was originally produced on the briefing note, which looks at dwelling increases since 2005. And unfortunately, I don't have dwelling numbers before 2005, but I don't think that house building has suddenly started in Midlothian as of 2005. And I don't have any information about what types of housing were being built back in 2005 and before that. So this is all a bit difficult, but I don't for a minute think that house building has started in 2007-8, and yet in terms of what's actually happened to pupil numbers, you've got the evidence in front of you in terms of that table 1 with our original appeal statement, and the council's had that thought for much longer than that. And in figure 1 it shows how the percentage has changed in terms of actual pupil numbers and the PPRs graphically, which I think demonstrates that this is it is undoubtedly very complex trying to make the linkage. But from my point of view, the key point is, what is the PPR linking across the authority, and what might it get to, and how does that actually relate to housing, and how does it relate to, people having larger families and so on. Which, as the council has already said, even if house building were to stop now, that wouldn't mean there wouldn't be substantial increases. So the question before you is about how to assess what's right and proper to put onto a development in terms of the additional requirements that may arise.
And just based on your knowledge of the situation and the work you've done, can you just comment on the fact that if we look at the 2020 to 2024 period of time on figure 3, you go from around 5,400 people up to 6,800 people, and how realistic and reasonable that appears to you based on the work you've done?
Yeah, that does look reasonable to me. It's certainly a notable increase. I mean, even of itself, it's quite a significant addition, but it does seem to square up with other information that I've looked at, and so I think that is in relation
to the PPR 0.242.
Sorry, the 0.128 PPR, the green line.
So I was speaking about the 0.242. That's fine.
Yeah, sorry, the 0.242. Sorry, no, I can't see that at all, or even a modification of it to try and bring it down. Obviously, I haven't done it, and so I can't be sure where that line would be. But I think what Mr. Inglis is talking about would be a different blue line, but with some of the 0.242 going off the end of the graph, as it were. So I can't be sure where.
It's slightly flatter.
Yes, it would be slightly flatter, but even then, I think the green line to me looks realistic, and the blue line, well, it just looks highly unlikely.
Okay, I understand both parties' views on that, so I'm happy to move forward unless there's any final comments either party wants to make. We understand the difficulty of the figures, the complexity, link between pupils and housing. I kind of get all that, so I'm happy to move on to question 12. And this is just to understand what has changed since the pupil product ratio of 0.242 was agreed in the section 75. Happy to see the appellant's view first, the council's view.
Ma'am, I wonder if I could start just by saying a few comments. I think just by way of background, the appellant raised the issue of the pupil-product ratio with the council as far back as 2018 as a basis for discussion. But my understanding is, and I should add that I wasn't involved in the negotiation of the Section 75 agreement at that stage, but my understanding is that there was limited engagement on that point. And as part of that contact that was made with the council about the pupil product ratio, an earlier version of the briefing note, which is before you as part of this appeal, was exhibited to the council, although I should add that it did not contain as much detail as the current briefing note contains. But there was reference to the 0.128 pupil product ratio at that stage. Then following the narrative, the Section 75 agreement was entered into in 2019, but by that stage all other aspects of the agreement were agreed. So it was the view of the appellant that they would enter into the Section 75 in order to secure their planning permission. But on the basis that if following further work on it, if they felt they were justified in doing so and the need to do so, they could revisit the terms of the Section 75 under the modification provisions in the 1997 Act. So I just mentioned that by way of background, and in terms of further questions there, I'll hand over to Mr. Kinsman.
Before Mr. Kinsman come in, is it fair to say then that the appellant has never really agreed to the figure, but to get the planning permission, they entered into the agreement, because in all other respects there was agreement on other contributions and obligations, but nothing really has changed in terms of policy background, anything like that, which would result in a different figure. It's just that from the very start you didn't accept the figure, but I totally get for commercial reasons it was more important to secure planning permission.
Yeah, in a nutshell, yes. I think the only thing that has potentially changed since then is a greater amount of investigation that's been carried out by the appellant to justify their position. But yeah, no change to policy.
Mr. Kingsman, did you want to add anything before I hand over to the council?
Yes, not much to say. Just to confirm that version of the note that was sent to the council dealt with primary and secondary and majored on primary, where one of the concerns was about the cost per place. And you know, you've heard that things have proceeded separately regarding primary, but the figure of 0.128 was always out there. So from our point of view, nothing has changed, but this is our opportunity to try and address the secondary education issue.
Mr. Atkins, from your perspective, do you think anything's changed?
There's probably not much I can add on that, other than that we had fairly extensive discussions back in 2018 with the appellant's representatives in the preparation of the Section 75. To be fair to them, they did raise at that time, as Mr. Mitchell's noted, issues around the pupil product. But ultimately, I think, you know, the council's position was that there was a logical justification for the 0.242, and that remains the case. Hence, us all being here today, and ultimately we proceeded to conclude the Section 75 and grant the plan permission on that basis. But as the appellants have they've said, and it's perfect, they're right. They've come back to modify on that particular point, and here we are today.
Would you accept there's no change to policy or anything like that?
That's correct. The supplementary guidance is the 2012 one, which, as it happens, has the 0.22 secondary figure. I think there is a logic for and a basis for the 0.242, but there is not a more recent policy that changes the position on that.
Okay, thank you. I was just want to understand. I thought that was the case, but I thought just as part of the comment on it to be sure that I hadn't not paid attention to something. Okay, so moving on to question 13. Now, again, it may be that you've covered this in some of the evidence you've given me because you haven't given me evidence on how you've come to the 0.242. It was just what evidence is there to support that figure, and the fact you referred to it now being established Midlothian secondary people product, and how and where has it been established. Now, if you think you've covered it, that's fine. I know you've got the calculation, it's 5.5 sevenths that gives you the percentage of 0.242, and you've explained how you get to that by using 1 for a year, S5 is less than that. So I understand that, and if that is the evidence, that's absolutely fine. And I guess from the established point of view, we've discussed the fact that this figure has been in policy for, well, 0.22 has been in policy for a considerable amount of time, and this has been revised upwards in light of doing that calculation. Is there anything else you want to add to that?
I don't know if Mr. Inglis wants to add anything. I think you've encapsulated it well, madam.
Yes, I think we have nothing further to add about how we've arrived at the 0.242. We're clear on that, then clear as probably finished.
I mean, does the panel want to add into that? I'm happy to move on because I'm happy to understand what the council evidence is and where it is and the extent of the evidence. So I'm happy to move on to question 14. And again, you may have think you've answered this in relation to other questions. It was just given the light of the tables, whether the council has been reasonable in requiring a people product ratio of 0.242, and whether using that ratio, the plan obligation would meet the test in Circular 3 2012. Maybe this one for you, Mr. Atkins, I don't know.
Thank you, madam. I think the council's position is, and I think we've kind of touched on this territory already in relation to the previous questions, but having regards to the scale of house building in Midlothian that's already happened, it's due to take place, the lag effects that we've talked about, and what Mr. Inglis has outlined in terms of the staying on of pupils in secondary schools, some of the incentives around that. And if you do have some regard to some evidence of higher primary pupil products, which has yet to sort of trickle through in terms of secondary pupils, I think that a 0.242 secondary pupil product is justified in regards to the tests, particular scale and kind test, because, and we might come on to this a bit later on as well, essentially Section 75s, particularly for local authorities, are essentially a one-way street, that we have to essentially negotiate them and conclude them at a point in time before a development takes place, and councils can't come back to developers and say a decade on, oh, sorry, can we have a bit more? It has to be done now. Now, there's always the potential that if it transpires down the line, that in terms of the proportionate element of infrastructure that the developer is contributed towards, in effect, there's been what amounts to an over-collection. If it comes to it, there can be a refund, but we can't do it the other way and go back and say, sorry, please can we have some more? So I think, and that's particularly the case with large scale development. So I would say that, as you'd expect I would, that 0.242 is justified and does meet the tests.
We'll come on to the clawback, clause 6, slightly later on. From the PEL's perspective, I also got from your hearing statement your views as to whether it does meet the test or not, particularly in scale and kind. Is there anything else you want to add to that evidence that isn't already in your hearing statement based on what you've heard today?
Sorry, ma'am. I think our evidence is what's contained in the hearing statement.
That's fine. It was, it was quite full in the hearing statement, so it's no, I'm not reading into the fact you've nothing else to add because there's quite a lot in your hearing statement. Okay, moving on to question 15. Now this was in thinking about the people product ratio of 0.128, and just working that through, I just wonder, is it reasonable to assume that in a development of 350 houses, there'd only be 45 secondary pupils generated? And maybe that's an overly simplistic way of looking at it, of looking at it from a layman's perspective, to kind of think about the reasonableness of it. I think about it in that respect, which might be wrong, and you can totally correct me, then would that meet the test in Circular 3 2012?
So I think you're looking at me to respond to that, Mom. I mean, clearly we do think it's reasonable. It's important to emphasise what we're talking about is the additional demand that the development is placing on education, as we've spoken about earlier on. But the evidence that you've put before you, I think, supports that figure of 0.128, which results in an increase of approximately 45 secondary age pupils. I'd want to make the point that reference is often made to housing generating pupils, and clearly children and then school pupils are the result of a different sort of process other than house building. And what housing is doing is providing the opportunities for people to live in different places to where they were living before. So whilst some houses will obviously be occupied by families, some may be new to the area and others may be coming from elsewhere in Midlothian and so on. This is why we say the wider circumstances need to be taken into account, which we've already discussed here. And you know, in essence, this is about understanding what the real impact on secondary education is, and what the reasonable pupil product is to apply in that case. So yes, and you've got it in our evidence about why the 0.128 does represent a planning obligation that meets the tests. I think you're on mute, Mum.
Always happens at some point in the hearing that you're on mute when you don't mean to be. And what I'm saying is, what I'm taking from that is you're taking the fact that it's 45 additional pupils that are going to have an impact on the secondary system. Yet there may be more that come out of that development, but they may have come from elsewhere in Midlothian, so it's a displacement rather than additionality.
Yeah, yes, exactly. This is, you know, I'm not disputing there may at some point be more than 45 pupils living within the development, but that's really a different question in my view. And an important distinction between that and the primary figures that we talk about.
For the reasons that we discussed earlier.
Exactly.
Okay. I was just thinking during the break, that's often the danger when you have a break in proceedings, about this dilution between the impact of a secondary school and the impact of a primary school. I get the difference, I can understand the difference, how primary schools are very local. You don't bus kids extreme for primary school, we tend to go to a small catchment school, where it's different for secondary schools. And I just wondered if that dilution effect, if you want to call it that, is already taken account of in the different pupil product ratios for primary and secondary. So it's already kind of factored in when the pupil product ratios are defined by the council. I don't know if anyone's got a view on that. It was just when I was thinking about it, I just wanted to know whether that's already been factored in. That's why they're different figures. So one for Kingston or England. Or you can start off with Kingston and let the council come in.
Yeah, I'm happy to say that from my understanding, the council hasn't factored this into their 0.242 or indeed the 0.22. And we've sought a simple mechanism that does take it into account.
Could you clarify what you mean by that effect? You mean a geographical shift or
was evidence we heard earlier that the impact of a secondary school can be diluted for various reasons. Bigger catchment areas, kids might go elsewhere for schooling. And I just wondered if that was the reason why the figure for the primary school product pupil ratio and the secondary school are different to start with, because you take into effect the fact that they don't necessarily all go to the same school. And it may be the fact you haven't taken into account because you don't agree there's a dilution, which I think is your evidence too. You don't agree there's a dilution impact because, albeit there's larger catchments, there's more development to factor into that catchment, therefore the impact's the same. But it was just to know, I maybe just want to explain then why the figures are different to start with, and it maybe comes down to the fact that those coming from P7 are less than those coming into S1, which you commented on before.
So the reason that the rates are different, it's 0.308 for primary and 0.424 for secondary, is purely down to the different number of years of school in the two stages, and also the ability of children to leave at the end of S4 and S5.
Okay. Okay, that's very straightforward. I totally get that. Thank you. Does the council want to add anything in relation to whether using the product pupil ratio of 0.128 would meet the test in the circular? I think I understand your position wouldn't from a scale and count perspective, but is there anything else you want to add?
I think we've set out our position on that, madam, but as you'd expect, our position is that it would, in our view, fail the tests with particular regard to the scale and kind test.
And that is clear from your evidence, just that you had to add, so that's absolutely fine. Question 16, and I'll put this to both parties. Would the planning obligation based on the pupil product ratio of 0.22 meet the test in Circular 3 2012? Now, I think I've got a position from the appellant in your hearing statement. Just wonder what the council's view on that would be.
Obviously, we've got a position where the, if you like, the extant position is we have contributions based on a 0.242 pupil product, and I think we've set out the sort of basis and logic for that. Notwithstanding that, madam, in our view, a 0.221 would meet the test. That reflects the adopted supplementary guidance and is the, if you like, the long established supplementary guidance position. So in our view, if you were, for example, on a without prejudice basis minded to take that approach, in our view, a 0.22 would meet the circular tests.
Yeah, I'll ask the appellant comment. I mean, I do have your position in your hearing statement as to whether this complies or not, but do you want to add anything in light of what the council said?
Ma'am, if I could just add something, Mr. Kinson may have something to say afterwards, but just to make the point that if it is the council's position that 0.22 as a pupil product ratio does meet the test contained in Circular 3 2012, that in my view inevitably means that 0.242 must fail the test, because if 0.22 satisfies it, which means it's adequate to mitigate against the negative impacts of this development or the adverse impacts of this development, then the council cannot seek more than that.
Mr. Atkins, do you want to respond?
I've nothing further to add on that, madam. Thank you.
Mr. Kinson, did you want to come in on this point?
No, thank you, ma'am.
In addition, Mr. Mitchell, to what you've just said there, you have set out your hearing statement why you considered that 0.22 would still fail the test in Circular 3 2012.
Yeah, absolutely, ma'am. And that is our submission, that paragraphs 10.3 and 10.4 of the hearing statement is still our submission.
Okay, I'm going to move on to 17, and this is just a point of clarification. might want you, Mr. Inglis, I don't know, but it was just to clarify the number of places would be at the new shore for a secondary school. There was different numbers used in the May 2019 document and the August 2019 document of 1800 and 1600, and I just wondered what it would be.
So thank you, ma'am. Yes, as we progress through developing and implementing the learning state strategy, we review the pupil requirements based on the agreed housing development of each area at that time. So as we go through the process, my colleague can probably expand on this a little bit more. There are discussions with, there is initial planning permission, line planning permission, which is granted based on a certain number of houses. And then as discussions progress, that number can change. So that we continue and constantly update what our expectations are for the requirement of the classes of our schools in line with those as they shift.
So at this point in time, are you working on the basis of 1800 spaces or 1600 spaces, or is that going to continue to flex over time?
Until such a time as what we tend to build now is where there may be future developments and others, we will build a school and then allow for its ability to expand. So we have not yet at this time started the build of this project, and therefore final decision about what capacity it will be built to is not.
So at this point in time, they're both kind of indicative figures.
Yes, yes. So once all the final numbers for the housing developments are confirmed, then that's at the point at which a final figure can be established, or we will make a judgment at the time when we have to start the construction process.
On that basis, how do you work out the cost per pupil contribution?
I think that moves on to slightly into question 18. So
Yes, 19. I can go on to that point then. If that's, I can leave that till then. It's fine.
Yes, okay. So Scottish Futures. So do you want me to cover that just now?
We'll come back to that one. But we'll probably touch on just the fact how do you calculate it? But we'll cover that then. Just that question 17. I'm not sure if Pellin's got anything to add. It was just a point of clarification, but you're welcome to add something or ask an additional question or comment.
I'll probably have a combination of the two of those things, ma'am, if that's okay. First of all, just to explain that when we carried out the calculation in our hearing statement by reference to the new build at Shawfair, we included reference to the 1800 units, and that gave the figure there. Just for completeness, we have also carried out a calculation based on 1600 units, which comes out with a figure of, and this is using the pupil product of 0.242. It comes out with a contribution of £2,072,725,000. And to place that into context, that's £280,000 lower than the secondary contribution that's contained in the existing Section 75 agreement. There is one other aspect of that as well, which
in your appeal statement, isn't it?
It's in the appeal statement. Absolutely, sorry, the appeal statement at 1800 units. That's right.
And the calculation on 16 is showing the difference. That's set out in your appeal statement.
The calculation setting out the 1800 figure is in the appeal statement, ma'am. Yeah. And the figure I just gave you is if you recalculate that based on 1600 units.
Okay.
So the 1800 units comes out broadly at £1.8 million.
Yeah.
Carrying out that calculation with 1600 necessarily increases the contribution because we're a higher proportion. So that takes up to roughly £2 million. And as I say, that's based on a pupil product ratio of 0.242. It's also based on the total costs of the school, which are shown in the schedule to the learning estate strategy. So the total cost estimate is £39.016 million. And that's shown in the second column, the cost estimate column. There is, however, a further column which refers to development funding, which reduces that total figure to £37.752 million. Now, this is where the question comes in, and it may be one for Mr. Atkins or it may be one for Mr. Ingalls. Just to clarify, which figure is the figure that developers would work to? And I am aware that in other schools you get a total figure, and then that figure is reduced because there's maybe elements of the school build which are for community use or something of that order. And so that cost is not passed on to developers. But it's really to clarify, and I'm not asking the council to commit to the calculation as it were, but more where the expectation would be for developer funding.
Okay, can we touch on that? Maybe in relation to 19, which I've asked how the proposed per pupil contribution is calculated.
Yeah,
I'm not trying to cover that
absolutely.
point. I had noted that there is what's classed as a funding gap and the two different figures used. I did wonder why and what that means. So we can cover that. And
actually, ma'am, I suppose the point in relation to question 17 is, you know, without getting into the calculation, which I'm happy to share, but is if it is the lower figure, then that would naturally reduce the secondary contribution further. Yeah, because your starting point's lower. Absolutely, yeah. Okay, I think 18 is probably a simple answer from the council before we get actually on to how you calculate the contribution. You're using the Scottish Futures Trust metric, which is a 2011 figure, which should be rebased and index linked. And then you've got the cost estimate in the learning estate strategy document, but you're using the Scottish Futures Trust metric, and I'm assuming that's because you haven't actually gone out and costed the school. You've got the cost estimate, and that's probably the best estimate based on other school builds in Scotland. Is that fair? That's why you use it?
Yeah, the Scottish Futures Trust metric provides a well-established benchmark for what schools in Scotland cost to build. So it's a well-established benchmark, and obviously it's index linked. So that is the basis for the education contributions in this agreement, and indeed many other agreements.
And I'll just go straight into the next question, and the appellant will get a chance to comment after that. If you can go through how you've calculated the per pupil contribution, that would be really helpful from my perspective.
Sure. So essentially, you've got, if you take the Scottish Futures Trust figure, well, if you start with the number of pupils that we would, secondary pupils that we would expect this development to generate using the 0.242 pupil product, and then you have the pupil floor space requirement of 11 square meters, and then you have a per square meter cost based on the SFT metric, and essentially you times all that together. We also have an element of council borrowing because we forward fund our schools. That gives you a total, if you like, contribution figure. And if you divide that by the number of pupils, that gets you to the 27,732 as you've set out in your question.
Right, it's okay. So let's go through it again. So you've got the number of people, which is 0.24 using the pupil product ratio at that point.
Yeah.
And then you're taking your floor space per pupil.
Yeah.
and you're using 11.
Yeah, so you'd have 85 pupils, and then if you times that by 11, that gets you to 935 square meters.
Mhm.
And then you would times that by the per pupil, sorry, the per square meter cost amount from the SFT metric at that particular index point, which I have to confess, I don't have that particular figure in front of me at this moment, but
Base cost per square meter is 1,900.
but that obviously indexed up to the
In
point we're talking about.
Toronto.
So
Yeah.
yeah.
And that gives you your so what does that figure give you? The 935 times your index linked base cost. No, not the actual figure, but what figure does that in the context of this give? How does that equate back to the per pupil contribution?
If you times that by 85, so I mean that gets to 2,357,220, because if you divide that by 85, which is the pupils generated, that gets you to the 27,732 in your question 19, Mum.
Would you divide it by 85 or would you divide by the number of houses? I'm just because you're starting off by using the pupil product ratio of 0.242, which gives you 85. But then we take it in that 85 into account again at the very end. Is that what we're saying?
Well, that would get you to the pupil contribution. Obviously, the per house contribution is slightly different because there's obviously a difference between number of pupils and number of houses.
It's just using the number of pupils twice that I think I'm just struggling with. So we start off with the number of pupils because we're using the pupil product ratio against the number of houses of 85. We then times that by the floor space, and we get the floor space figure. We times that by base cost per square meter from SFT index linked from Q2 2011. That gives you your 2.3 figure, 2.3 million figure. And then you're saying you divide that back by 85 again to get your cost per pupil.
In essence, I mean, obviously that's the sort of if you get to the if you like the total amount that we're talking about, divide that by the number of pupils that based on 0.242, that gets you a per pupil contribution. But obviously, if you were to divide that total amount by 350, which is the total the number of houses proposed, that would
different contribution.
Quite different. And obviously, in terms of the obligation, that's expressed in terms of tranches of 20, 25 units on a per house basis. So I'm not sure if that assists.
No, that's okay. So we're looking at per pupil contribution, not per house, and it is based on tranches. You're saying at different points in time those tranches are paid.
Yeah.
Okay. So you're not looking at starting points, which perhaps I thought you might do. How many cost of a school, the number of places, and doing a simple cost per pupil at that school. That's not the starting point. You've done it from the kind of bottom up, I suppose, as opposed to top down.
Yeah, and I mean, to be honest, sometimes these things can become refined. You know, as I say, the Scottish Futures Trust metric is a logical and well-established sort of starting point for these things. We're not at the point where we've got actually a tendered cost for the school. And as I mentioned earlier, obviously for councils, obligations are essentially a one-way street. So it's a highly logical place to start, even if, you know, when an actual tendered cost is established, the position might change slightly.
So what relevance are the figures in the learning estate strategy and that the cost estimate, the developer funding and the funding gap? Is that not relevant in the context of calculating a contribution? Or do you use it to bench check where your contributions sit to know how much of a shortfall you've got?
Yeah, I mean, that sort of presented a picture at a point in time, certainly update in terms of 2019, but I'm not sure that necessarily diminishes the sort of basis of using the SFT metric for individual agreements, this and many others. And as Mr. Inglis has said, that even in terms of exactly what size school will deliver there at the outset, that's still got to be firmly established. So, you know, these are things where we're not at fixes on this yet.
So in essence, you haven't used the figures from the update to understand you've done it using SFT. And would you sense check it back to what your cost estimate is looking like for that school to know whether this is a reasonable figure to use?
Yeah, I mean, we do sense check these things. I mean, I'm not sure it's helpful in this particular context of the education, but to take another example from this agreement, as Mr. Mitchell alluded to earlier, in terms of the Borders Rail, the council reflected on the position that was put to us in relation to that shortly after the agreement was completed, and if you like, we carried out a sense check on relation to that in terms of the position that had been reached on that, and we reflected on that in terms of the revised downwards the level of contribution on that. So, you know, it's partly a timing thing, but we do sense check.
Okay, I'll ask the panel if you've got any comment or questions.
Well, thank you, ma'am. I have to say I'm very confused with the cost per place numbers and the various ways to work them out. With regard to the calculation which has just been explained to us, it seems to me incorrect that there's a multiplier of 11 for the number of square metres per pupil, because if you look at the Scottish metric information which is in Appendix 13 to the Council's information, you've obviously probably got it to hand, but for a school that's going to be 1,200 plus pupils, which is what the council is saying, whether it's 16 or 1,800, the multiplier there should be 10 square metres. So I'm a bit surprised.
I've got the document in front of me as well, and the council comment is that I was thinking that the reason they haven't used 10 is they're doing it from the bottom up perspective. That doesn't work either.
No.
Maybe based on 85 people. So yeah, the council can go back and comment on that, because I've got 12,000 plus is 10 square metres per pupil.
Yeah.
Okay.
And the other thing is that if you look at the two updates to the learning estate strategy, what you find is that in the May update, which is Appendix 6 to the council, you've got a 1,600 place school costing over £43 million. And then in the later update, and I think that's the one we referred to, and it's in our documents at PVL 14, it's an 1,800 place school at a cost of £39 million. So I thought there was some muddle up around the capacity, but it's not really been explained today. But that's actually a 10% and exactly 10% reduction in the cost of the school, despite the fact that it's grown by 200 places. So there are quite a lot of confusing figures around the cost per place. Having said all that, we are not actually disputing the cost per place that's embedded in the Section 75 today, but it would be helpful to understand the figures a bit better, I think.
I know you're not disputing it, but I've got to be sure that it makes sense. That's why I'm asking questions on it, because it wasn't overly apparent to me how the figure had been calculated. But Mr. Atkins has explained how it's been calculated. Do you want to comment on the floor space question, Mr. Atkins, whether it should be 11 or 10?
Well, certainly what we were working to was 11, and not to sort of push the question as it were, but I don't know whether you've got, if you want to throw anything there, Mr. Inglis, in terms of 11 versus 10, as it were. The advice I'd had at the time was 11 was the appropriate figure to be working to for the accommodation of this size for such a school.
And I'm just waiting for that paper to open, so I've got the figures in front of me.
While you're doing that, maybe I'll just ask the fact that the figure has changed from the May update to the August update, with 10% reduction with 200 more pupils in the school, or 200 more pupil capacity in the school. From what you've said, I think that hasn't factored in to your calculation of the cost per pupil, because your cost per pupil is based on this SFT metric as opposed to those costs.
Yeah, and it's also worth noting that the actual negotiation, aside from those points, the negotiation of this agreement, as Mr. Mitchell noted, the agreement was completed in 2019, well, in the early summer of 2019, but the bulk of it was essentially settled, I think, if I recall correctly, at the end of 2018, and there was a period for the parties to sign it. So, yeah.
So before the updates came out, effectively.
Yeah, essentially, yeah.
And I guess from the council's perspective, Osman, how do you know this contribution is reasonable in scale or time when you don't know the cost of the school?
Well, that's where the SFT metric comes in again. That's the logical, the logical basis of building schools in Scotland.
Okay.
And just to also clarify on that same point, in terms of the currency of the figure, perhaps Mr. Atkins could just confirm the indexation is taken into account up to what date as far as the Section 75 is concerned? So
well, sorry, Mr. Kinton. Well, the base point, let me just check, it's actually the numerical point is 0.269, which I think was, let me just check.
yeah, if
The
I can
quarter 1 2015, the base.
Oh, Mr. Kingsman, you're mute.
Yes, I was just having a dialogue with
sorry.
Mr. Mitchell, but just to explain what I was saying, really, for the benefit of all, perhaps. So I agree that is what's in the document. So we've got a 27,000 plus per place figure in the Section 75 as it stands, which seems to conflict with the cost per place if you work it out. That's in the Learning Estates update. So I don't quite understand how the costs have been worked out for the Learning Estates update, but if you look at the May document, for example, I'm sure it says in that document that the sums are based on current price estimates. And for that document, it comes out at a cost per place of about £24,000.
but if I can step in, ma'am. So I don't have the detailed calculations. There is a spreadsheet on the network somewhere that sets out these calculations, but I don't have it to hand at the moment. When we do an update on the learning estate strategy and the costs, we use the current BCIS figure, which is the Building Costs Information Scotland, I think is the acronym. Figures when we're doing that calculation, and we do that refresh. So that figure is indexed to the, well, the figure we use, the index point that we use is the midpoint of the construction of the school. And because these are future dates, we're looking at constructing the Shawfair Secondary so that it would be open in 2026 in those two updates papers. That would be the indexation point that we would have used, would have been probably in 2025 as the midpoint of building the school, which would take us about 2 years. So that it may well be that the BCIS indexation for that point in the future had changed between those two update papers.
Do you want to comment also on the floor space point, whether it should be 11 square metres to 10 square metres per pupil?
Without having the calculation in front of me, I wouldn't want to give a definitive answer, but the council's standard policy is to use the SFT metric for the floor area of the size of school which is being constructed. If that was not the case in this case, then there must be a good reason for it, but I don't have it to hand, so I'm not able to. Unless it's set out in one of the papers, I haven't.
I don't think it is set out in the papers. It's just come out of the discussion just now. If anyone gets any other comments, I think from my summary of the position for the proposed per pupil contribution is that the cost in the learning estate strategy, whether it's May or April, and the number of places is largely irrelevant. And instead, the council bottom up, looking at the number of pupils coming out of the development, the SFT floor space, index linked the base cost of £1,900, and then get that figure and divide it back by the number of pupils to get the cost per pupil, which is what goes into the Section 75 agreement.
Yeah.
And based on the fact that you haven't got, you haven't tendered for the build, you haven't got a final design or for the school, anything like that, that in your view would be the most reasonable position to take. Bear in mind that SFT is benchmarked across Scotland, across all schools built in Scotland. And I suppose the council would then ultimately take the hit if your school's more expensive at the end of the day. Is that fair enough?
Well, that's essentially what it amounts to, ma'am, that it's obviously about what this other developments reasonably give rise to in terms of their capacity. Obviously, if the council ends up building a more expensive school, the council, and if there's a gap because of the statutory requirement to educate children in the administrative area, in effect, we would have to meet that. But it is at a point, the point in time where we started doing this agreement was 2018. That's some way off the time when we were actually going to be tendering and delivering the school. So the SFT metric, and as you describe it, the bottom-up approach to calculating a contribution was, I think, the most reasonable way of doing it, rather than saying to developers, well, you're just going to have to wait to get a really accurate, even more accurate figure when we've actually tendered. But that clearly wouldn't be reasonable. But that's not to say that as say a tendered school or a tender emerges, that things can't be refined at a point in time if the need arose.
Just as a little addition to that, ma'am, the last update to the learning estate strategy that we've been discussing is in August 2019, which, as we're all aware, predates the pandemic, which has had a significant impact on material costs, construction time periods, which then adds to costs. We've also got the climate emergency and the drive towards net zero carbon. So in terms of the next update on the cost of the learning estate strategy in this particular school will be reflected in a considerably greater cost of these items. but that doesn't, that doesn't then get taken back. As my colleague just explained, that doesn't then get back. The council has to meet that shortfall.
Yeah, because you're basing it on the SFT metric.
Well, we base it on the best available figure at the time when the agreement is reached. So the SFT metric now, if we looked forward into 2025 when the school is projected to be built, will have been updated to reflect these factors.
Yeah,
at the time
I get that at that point in time, yes, because that's the best evidence you've got. Yeah, I understand that at that point. Does the panel have anything you want to comment on or add to this?
Ma'am, just a couple of points, and it's really just to make sure I'm picking up Mr. Ingalls correctly in terms of what he said about indexation, because if I follow his evidence, he was saying that the learning estate strategy from August 2019 has the most up-to-date figures at the moment, and I think we all accept that there'll be further updates as time goes by. But it was the indexation point on those. Now, is it the case that the indexation point on those figures is already anticipated to being the midpoint of the build, or has that indexation still to be applied? So I suppose the other way of asking the question is it your understanding that the figures contained in the learning estate strategy were correct as at the cost of a school in August 2019, or were they looking forward to the midpoint of the build?
So I would need to, apologies ma'am, I would need to go and find the paperwork that was related to that. I wasn't directly involved in writing that, so I would wish to commit either way on this at the point.
And that's okay, and I don't mean to, it was just, I wonder if I've just picked up the point on indexation incorrectly there, because I suppose my point, ma'am, was just going to be that the per pupil cost under the figures contained in the learning estate strategy from August 2019 are significantly lower than the per pupil cost that would be calculated under the SFT metric. And just doing rough sums, which again, this is just simple arithmetic of the cost of the building divided by the number of pupils. For an 1800 unit school or 1800 pupil school under the total cost of 39 million, you would have a 21,675 per pupil cost. For 1800 units for the developer cost of 37.752 million, you'd have a 20,973 pound cost, and that goes up slightly if it's a 1600 unit school, but the highest number is 24,000 under the total costs, 24,385 pounds, and for the developer's cost that would be 23,595 pounds. So I suppose I was just looking to place that into context, because the 27,000 figure that we have at the moment attracts indexation going back to Q1 in 2015 under the terms of the Section 75 agreement. So there's obviously the possibility of a significant uplift even on that figure to get us up to the August 2019 point. But I think in fairness, ma'am, in the circumstances, there's maybe only so much weight you can place on that particular point, because we don't have the evidence from the council to confirm one way or the other.
We don't, and to be fair to the council have explained how they've calculated the figure.
Absolutely.
Which is a different approach. I had taken the approach you were taking into my own calculations, which is why I couldn't get to the figure of 27,000. I just didn't know how you, that's why I asked the question, because I didn't know how you got to that figure. But I was taking a top-down approach. Obviously the council evidence today is they've taken the bottom-up approach and explained why and why they consider that's reasonable. You're not disputing the figure. Maybe you're going to walk away today with some questions, but you're not disputing the figure. I just got to be satisfied that based on the evidence I've got, that it is reasonable in the circumstances that that figure is applied, which is why I've asked a bit more about the figure. And I understand what the council has done. I've also got other evidence about the cost of the school places, and I just had to weigh that up and come to my conclusion on that going forward. But I don't think I've got any further questions on that, unless anyone else does have questions.
Could I just say that I'd expected to find a link between the way in which the council calculates a contribution from a development and the way in which it calculates the cost of its school estate strategy figures. But irrespective of that, as Mr. Mitchell says, we perhaps don't need to worry too much about that. But just to note, the use of the multiplier for square meterage is really unexplained, and that does come into the figure that you're considering, which is the one in the section 75. And the other point, just to stress for clarity, is that reference to any impacts of the pandemic on materials costs and indeed on efforts to get to net carbon neutral, those costs will come into the indexation that's applied under the section 75 and won't fall as an additional burden obviously on the council, because the indexation of costs will take that into account.
Okay, does the council have any more comments on that? Is everyone happy to go through, sorry, who's?
I was just going to say, I don't think we've got anything further to add to what we've already said, but thank you, ma'am.
I'm just conscious of time. Is everyone happy to go through the last couple of questions, and I'll discuss the thing about concluding remarks and closing submissions separately? Are we happy to just cover those two last points off, or would people prefer a break and come back?
I think we're happy to continue, ma'am. Oh, sorry, I speak for the appellant only when I say that.
I'm not sure the last 2 points will take too long, to be honest. The first point 20 is just a clarification point. And the second point might be a bit more discussion. So if you're happy just to carry on, hopefully we get finished by 1:30. Is that okay? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, question 20. This is really just for the appellant, just to confirm what figure I should be looking at. I mean, there's not a huge amount between the two figures, but I'm assuming I should go with the hearing statement figure of £89,138.57.
Actually, ma'am, it's the revised section 75 agreement at PVL 13, I think, is the one that should be preferred. I think there's a rounding up issue in terms of the hearing statement figures.
Well, it's fine enough. I think when I originally did the calculation, I got the hearing statement figure. Let me just see. I think I looked at it in your field statement. Yeah, when I calculated it in there, when I just initially got allocated the case, I looked at your appeal statement and the calculation, and I think it was 2.3 of that. When I did the calculation myself, I came out to £89,138.57, which was subsequently the figure that you have used in the hearing statement, which differs from the section 75 agreement, which is £89,139.70.
Yes. Now, I'm just going to quickly redo that calculation just to be. Yeah, I still get the section 75. So on the basis of the total cost being 1.247955 million and 75 pence.
That's where I've got a slightly different figure. Right, okay, yes, if you take, so I've got a figure of £1,247,940. Sorry, £1,247,940 I've noted down. But you're using the figure of £1,247,925.75.
Yeah.
And you're right, I think to divide that by, as your calculation is, you do get that figure of £98,139.70.
Yeah.
Which is the correct figure. Okay. I assume the council have got an issue with that. It's a mathematical calculation.
Yes, Mum.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think I wonder if it maybe came about as a result of the rounding. Well, I think it came about as the rounding out of the pupil yield number. But I mean, we're happy with the higher figure.
Okay. It may have done. Okay, now it was just make sure whatever outcome I come to that I'm working on the right figures. Okay. We'll go on to question 21. This is in relation to clause 6 of the section 75 agreement, which is effectively, I suppose you call it a clawback provision, whereby if more secondary school kids come out of the development, there would be an uplift in, or a recovery of an element, an additional amount from the developer. I just wondered that, does that give the council sufficient protection or comfort if I allowed or accepted modification of 0.128 and it turned out to be lower and higher than that going forward, that the council wouldn't kind of lose out? They'd have this protection built into the section 75. So from the council, what's your perspective on that?
Thank you, Mum. Obviously, that clause is in the agreement, and that was designed to deal with a situation where it appeared to the council, looking at Midlothian and housing developments as a whole in Midlothian, that we were experiencing, if you like, a higher than expected pupil product at primary and secondary level. So it wasn't just solely focusing on this development, but looking at Midlothian as a whole at an identified point into the rolling out of this development. But that was designed and around going above the, if you like, the established or supplementary guidance level of pupil product. Here, what the appellants are proposing is, in the council's view, to go to a level that is significantly below the established. So our view would be that it's, from the council's perspective, in terms of delivering essential infrastructure and its statutory requirements to provide education provision, to, if you were minded to agree this, but then to have that as a sort of identified safeguard to be going below, but relying on some future evidence that might or might not emerge as a kind of sort of belt and braces, as it were, in that circumstance.
Okay. Mr. Mitchell.
Yeah, I mean, the appellant's view is that the short answer is yes, and in fact it acts as a safeguard for the 0.242 pupil product ratio, as well as the 0.128, because clause 6.1 enables the council to undertake a review of the pupil product ratio. That's within 2 years of completion of the first residential unit, and that review must be based on the updated Midlothian pupil census figures, which I understand is what formed the basis for their SPG as well. And following that through, if the analysis does show that the pupil product ratio from the development exceeds, well, in this case it would be 0.128, then, and the council share that analysis with the developer, then and it's accepted, and there's the dispute resolution clause as well, but if that evidence is robust and it is accepted, then that's the pupil product ratio that would apply, and it applies in connection with the SFT figures, which we've broadly discussed earlier as well, in terms of calculating the uplift. So you take the difference between the newly established pupil product ratio and the the 0.128 in this scenario. And then you multiply that by the SFT metric to get the increased costs. And combined with that, there's also a sanction imposed by clause 6, whereby the developer or the landowner, as it's expressed, but ultimately the developer will be unable to allow more than 200 units to be occupied until that uplift payment is paid. So there's a timescale attached to that as well. The final thing I would say as well is that there's a similar clause in 5.6 of the agreement which attaches to primary education, and that imposes a cap of 0.47 as a pupil product ratio, but a comparable cap does not apply to the secondary pupil product ratio. Now, it's not our expectation that the pupil product ratio will ever get close to that, but if it were to, then there's no bar on the council asking for the additional sums to take into account the entirety of that uplifted pupil product ratio.
Mr. Atkins, you want to come back and say anything on that?
I don't think I've anything to add to what I've already set out there. So thank you.
Okay, I don't think I've got anything further to ask on that point. I also have got the agreement in front of me. I can look at that and the caps and things like that. Going to the last point was concluding remarks from the parties. Like bearing in mind the time, and also just reflecting on this cost per pupil calculation. And bearing in mind the evidence I have in front of me and things I don't have in front of me, I'm actually considering whether I come out with a specific question on that to satisfy myself on the figure. You've only got the evidence you've got, and I can't expect you to come up with an answer to things that you don't have evidence in front of you, and that's not fair either. It's not fair on either party either to be reactive to it. But given that I need to satisfy myself if I'm mind to grant what that figure should be, and the floor space question is at that, I think it might be more beneficial for me to issue a procedure notice covering that point and asking you to, in the context of that, to comment on that, and also provide a written closing submission, concluding remarks, key points you want to highlight in the context of the appeal they want me to take away. Also, I don't think it's either for either party, given that by the time we've been on this call, to do that at this point in time, to be fair. There's been quite a lot of maybe new additional things that have come to light, which again, parties might want to reflect on. That would probably be my preference at this point in time to do that. I wouldn't expect lengthy closing submissions. Don't rehearse the whole case. It's almost just pulling together the key message you want me to take out. If that's bullet points, that's fine. You don't need to go into all background of the case, anything like that. I'm not going to put a word count on it because I'm not sure that really helps. I just want you to focus on the key message you want me to take away from the hearing today that I've heard in the evidence. But I think it should be beneficial for me to clarify a little bit more around the price per pupil calculation. I would aim to get that procedure notice out. It might be just at the start of next week. Just think about our case officers and things like that. And I intend to probably give parties 2 weeks and 2 weeks to respond to that. As a way forward to close out the session, does that seem acceptable to parties? I'm not trying to prolong the appeal or decision in any way. I just think it's beneficial to me to get that little bit more evidence on that point, and give parties a chance to sum up in the best way they can. Mr. Mitchell, are you content with that approach?
I'm certainly content with the approach of issuing a procedure notice. The only question I had was on timescales there. Was it your intention there for 2 weeks for the council and then a further 2 weeks for us to respond to the council's submission? Is that what you meant by the 2 weeks and 2 weeks?
Yes, it was.
Yeah. I mean, if I'm honest, the appellants would accept a tighter timescale than that, but we're certainly
I accept that point. The reason I'm saying 2 weeks and 2 weeks is that in terms of the regulations, a response to a procedure notice from the party commenting on the further submission is 2 weeks. You can put your submission in within 2 or 3 days, 7 days if you wish, because you're responding, and that's up to you. But I'm kind of bound by that time scale generally at that point. Submissions earlier would be more than welcome. But to be fair to both parties, that's why I said 2 weeks and 2 weeks.
Well, that's fine, and no issue from the appellants on that front.
Mr. Atkins, what about, would you be okay with that approach?
Yeah, the council will be content with that approach. Thank you, Mum.
Okay, I think it would just help me just on that point. Everything else has been really helpful today. Just digging into some of the points that I just required a little bit more understanding on has definitely helped my perspective on the case. I just say it's quite complex. There's a lot of things in there. But it's been really helpful. So thank you very much for your time, and thank you for running on rather than breaking for lunch. I think it was quite good to get it done while we're all in the mindset and immersed in it, which is always very helpful. And thank you for your cooperation on that, just that one point on the cost per pupil and the closing submissions. Again, I think that will help you draw it together. As I say, don't make them lengthy. Closing submissions is just the key points you want me to kind of take away from what we've heard today. That'd be very useful. Thank you again. You're all free just to kind of leave the link and enjoy the rest of your day, and thank you.
Thank you, Matt.